Tonight's special guest is Ian Wishart. Ian is the editor for Investigate magazine and is always in the thick of issues concerning us New Zealanders. Tonight we discuss Ian's brand new book called The Great Divide. Everything you ever wanted to know about the Waitangi Treaty that wasn't politically correct. We welcome Ian Wishart as our special guest on The Beat Goes On. Welcome, Ian Wishart. It's always good to see you, Ian.
Thank you.
You have a fertile mind. You wear that mantle proudly?
It's a job. We have been going with the publishing company since '95 and the magazine since 2000, so we've been getting into a few stories.
What are you trying to achieve every month with Investigate magazine?
Well, Investigate is really sort of a repository for stories that other media either don't have the resources or they're too scared to publish. We wanted to give people a perspective on things in long-form journalism that are happening behind the scenes that they need to be informed about, and people who need to be in touch, need to know what's happening, do read Investigate. They won't get those stories necessarily in the Herald or the papers or other magazines, but we do cover them.
There is a growing worldwide trend. You can see it all the time. The Ron Paulism, a section of our society, they've occupied Wall Street. They're a tribe, aren't they? They believe that the stories that they're given by the Murdochs and the Fairfaxes aren't the truth. So how is that developing?
It's a cynicism, I think, about the media in general, because a lot of journalism today is what we call rip and read. A press release comes out, you rewrite the press release and you call it news. And there's a timidity about tackling more difficult stories or assigning a reporter to cover deeper investigations. Because Investigate is beholden to nobody, it's not owned by a multinational, it's owned by New Zealanders. We have the liberty to publish and be damned, if you like, and cover those sort of stories. So although I'm not as deeply cynical about the mainstream media as perhaps some of the other groups are, I certainly see that there is a shallowness in daily media reporting, and not necessarily through fault of the journalists themselves. I mean, when you've only got 300 words to tell a story in the Herald or the Dominion Post or something like that, you can't go into it in the great detail that you can in a 5,000 word magazine article. So it's not for me on my high horse to say, gee, you haven't done a good job as I would.
They're constrained.
They're constrained. They don't have the space, they don't have the resources, their editors are not giving them the space. I mean, a big story in the Herald is 1,500 words. Well, as I said, a big story in Investigate can be 10,000 words. So you can measure the amount of information you're going to get from an Investigate magazine article against a big Herald feature. And you can say, well, we're just not going to get it from the Herald.
Now, you're doing all this, Ian, but in the meantime, you have time to come up with great books, and that's why you're on the program today, Ian, because you have a new book out called The Great Divide. It's the story of New Zealand and its treaty.
What I wanted to do with that was, like all New Zealanders, we've been through the education system. We've heard the stories about the Treaty of Waitangi.
What's the official spin story out there that we've all been told?
The official story that we've all been told, and everyone will be saying, yeah, I know this story, is that we signed the treaty in 1840 and the Pākehā cheated the Māori, and that Māori tribes didn't
know what was going on.
Didn't know what was going on. They didn't surrender their sovereignty, and they kept tino rangatiratanga, which was the right to independent self-government, as they saw it, and that the treaty therefore should have been interpreted as a partnership between two peoples with two sovereigns, the Queen Victoria on one side and the Māori nation on the other, and that they jointly govern New Zealand. Now that's the way the official story has run. That's the justification for what is happening now in terms of constitutional change, that we have two sovereigns, two rulers, the Māori and the Crown, and between them they join and give us a joint decision as to what the rest of us subjects have to do. But what I've done with The Great Divide is I've said, okay, let's accept, for argument's sake, that the official version is correct. Let's go back and check that claim. And what I've done is I've gone back to the official documents of all the explorers and settlers who came to New Zealand since basically Abel Tasman arrived here and wrote reports on it. And I've gone back and done the complete lead up to the Treaty of Waitangi so that we can see in context what Māori society was like, what political groupings existed within Māoridom, what their aspirations were, what they understood settlers to mean, what they understood the treaty to mean, so that we can get a clear photograph, a snapshot of 1840 and the years leading up to it, to say, what did Māori really think about the treaty? Forget about what you've heard now. Forget about what the Māori Party is saying and everyone else is saying about what the treaty means. What did Māori in 1840 believe they were signing?
What did they think they were getting?
Well, what they believed they were getting, they knew they were seceding their sovereignty.
They knew that?
They knew it. They explicitly had arguments about it at Waitangi, and they had huge discussions about it. And the reason that they did it was for several reasons. One was that the missionaries had come to New Zealand and they had brought the gospel to Māoridom. Māori society, up until the missionaries arrived, was a cannibalistic society. It was very Utu driven, and revenge raids were daily and commonplace, and a tribe would go along, they would take offence at something that another tribe had done or another family had done. They would go in, they would raid it, they'd take away the women and children, they'd kill the men, they'd enslave the women, and they'd eat the children. And so there was this tension, and there was no single Māori nation. There were just a collection of 40 or 50 tribes who had their own rules and fought amongst themselves.
Yeah.
Now add to that the system of food that they had. There was no real agriculture apart from kumara. And the kumara that they had were not the same as the ones you get in the shops today, which are big and fat in South America. And the kumara that they had back then were about the size of your finger. Yeah. They were not great sustenance. So the other major things they had were seafood and native pigeons and birds when they could catch them, and that was hard work. And fern root, which was the basic bread of their society. But to make fern root into edible
something you could eat,
you had to bash it for half a day. It was horrendously labour intensive, and so a lot of energy went into just providing enough for the next meal, as opposed to growing the tribe and growing its resources and everything else. So they didn't have a lot of food. They didn't have warm clothing. So when James Cook turned up and traded blankets and things like that, that's what the Māori wanted, because they said it keeps us warm. Yeah. it's a cold winter, and these Pākehā, they have warm blankets and warm clothes, and that was highly sought after. Then, of course, the next big thing once they became warm was iron, because Māori had no technology beyond stone, and the iron axes and what have you, and even nails that
that was sought after.
They were tremendously sought after, because for chopping down a tree and providing wood for your fire, an iron axe was much more efficient and much quicker than your greenstone Mary. So again, there was this vision of the advantage of the technology that was being brought in by the explorers. So by the time Waitangi came around, a lot of the Māori had been Christianised. They'd renounced their cannibalism. They had renounced their previous spirituality. They had accepted the religion of the settlers and the explorers and said, yeah, this is actually a really good thing for us, because we're no longer killing each other. We see that was wrong. We see that Utu was wrong. We see that our previous ways were wrong. We want to move forward. So they came to the table at Waitangi, with a belief that these settlers who had brought with them the gospel would act honourably. But they also understood that in doing so, that they needed to surrender their sovereignty to Queen Victoria, and that this would be a change in the way that New Zealand was forevermore. Now, there were tremendous debates about this at Waitangi. Some chiefs got up and said, do we want to be downtrodden in the lowest of the low? You've seen what the Governor of New South Wales is like. We don't want to be told that we can't do something just because the settlers now have a governor here. And other chiefs said, well, do you want to go back to eating fern roots that take you half a day to prepare, or are you happy with pork and bread? And warm clothes. And so there was a realisation that if they wanted the benefits of Pākehā civilization, they had to accept the terms of that. The Pākehā said, we will protect your land and your treasures and so forth, and make sure that you're not ripped off. And in return, you give us the sovereignty and we will govern the country. Now, the other reason that the Māori agreed to the sovereignty thing was because they were so disunited amongst themselves. They couldn't select a leader from within their own, because that would give that leader supreme mana and belittle the mana of the other chiefs. So the other reason they went to the missionaries and said, we want Britain to rule over us, is because the Queen from outside was seen as somebody independent and authoritative, whose mana overruled everybody's.
So there was some good thinking there, wasn't there?
There was some very clever thinking, and the key thing about the Treaty of Waitangi is that it wasn't. We only concentrate now on Waitangi and was it fair, and did the Māori know what they were signing. In 1860, the Māori leadership held the biggest hui they'd ever had at Kauimarama here in Auckland, and they ratified the Waitangi Treaty. They looked back over the previous 20 years between 1840 and 1860 and said, okay, we've seen the treaty in action. Some tribes said, well, we didn't sign it back then, but we agree fully with its terms and principles now. It's been honoured. It's gone well. We agree with the British coming here. We agree with the governor. We agree that there should be one queen, one governor, and under them the people of New Zealand in all forms and races and so forth. So they fully understood what they'd done. So this modern version that the Māori had no idea that they were giving away sovereignty is a load of old cobblers. By the same token, what our history and what the Great Divide does show is that certain European settlers and governors took advantage of Māori good faith. And
so there is an unscrupulousness.
There is an unscrupulousness
on following generations,
yes.
that, but not on that particular day. There was
tremendous honour in the Treaty of Waitangi, and it did exactly what it set out to do, which is surrender sovereignty to the Queen and to promise that Māori would not be forced to sell up or part with any of their lands that they didn't want to. And it's a really important story because in some ways there are things that both sides of the treaty debate will take out of the Great Divide, and they'll say this supports my view of how things should be. But what I wanted to do is bring both sides to the table and get them to understand what the other was going through.
When you say you wanted to bring both sides, who do you want to read this book? And will it be politically acceptable in our schools? Do you think that...
people are recommending that it should be required reading in the schools, and it should be.
Now, you say that, but
yeah, I do.
There is a group of people that probably don't want to know exactly what happened. They've got their agenda, haven't they?
Well, yeah, my own son's going through high school and doing the Treaty of Waitangi in the official curriculum, and the official curriculum bears no resemblance to the truth. And that's the shocking thing most parents would not be aware of. And that's why a book like The Great Divide is important, because if you can read it and give it to your kids to read and so forth, so they get a better understanding of what was going on, then they can raise questions in class and say, well, what about this? And the beauty of the book, of course, is it sources back to all the original documents, so that you don't have to rely on Ian Wishart's word. You can go back to Governor Gore Brown or Hobson or whatever.
Well, here's the core here. The average parent listens to his child telling him what he learnt at school today about the Treaty of Waitangi. So if he was to say anything to that child, he then has to go and do the amount of work that you've done. How many hours would you have put into this, and research and writing? A tremendous amount of time. Has the average parent today got that time that Ian Wishart has got to find out this, the Great Divide? So they haven't, have they?
No, they haven't.
And that's what's happening, that they just accept, well, you heard that story at school today, it must be true.
Yeah, they do. And
so how can you fight that?
The only way you can fight that is by educating yourself, really. And that's what it comes down to, parents and families to read the book and get a handle on their own history, because what's being taught is not true. And what's being taught is being done for a political reason, which is to soften everybody up for a new constitution which is going to enshrine the treaty partnership idea into law, where we have two chiefs over New Zealand, a Māori and a Pākehā, and they rule us as subjects. Now, is that the way New Zealanders really want their government to be, or do we want to be a democratic modern society? The treaty as it was signed was a great document. The treaty as it has now been interpreted is a sham. It's not true what you've been told about the Treaty of Waitangi. It's not true what Michael King wrote in his book, The Penguin History of New Zealand. He's misinterpreted, in my view, a heck of a lot of New Zealand history. And he should have known better, because he had access to the same documents I have. I've just quoted them in more detail so readers can judge for themselves. This is what really happened, and this is how you've been misled by other historians.
So Michael King...
He has spun it, which gets back to your political spin question.
Where's the agenda there with Michael King?
The agenda with Michael King is that he was paid a grant by the government or by the taxpayer to write this book, and the administration in power when he gained that grant was Labour, which had its own agenda in terms of treaty issues and its perspective on things. And as an academic, he's reflected the hand that fed him. The reality, as I've shown repeatedly in The Great Divide, is that Michael King got it wrong. And the story of New Zealand is not what the Penguin History of New Zealand, which sold 250,000 copies, actually claims it was. The story of New Zealand is a much more enriching story and a much more evenly balanced story than Michael King would have you believe.
What would you like to see happen with this book?
I would love to see every New Zealander read it, because this is our story, and we will not understand, and the people out there, the viewers, will not understand the treaty debate in its full context until they read a book that actually gives you the facts from the period concerned, where they can read it for themselves in the words of the time and understand this is what was meant. And so there is no way that anybody can ever confuse you again by saying, oh, this is what happened, and take my word for it because I'm an expert. You know, you can see for yourself in this book exactly what happened, chapter and verse. You can see for yourself exactly why Māori signed the treaty and why they knew what they were doing. You can see for yourself that a lot of arguments today about treaty settlements and the partnership concept don't ring true. Once you arm yourself with that knowledge, then you are free to take part in the wider debate in society on talkback, letters to the editor, or discussing it amongst friends and passing the word around. But if you don't read it, you really don't have any information with which to take to the debate, because people are simply giving you spin.
What about Honey? Has he read it?
Well, as I said, you know, there are things in that book that they will not like, but there are other things in that book that they will like. I mean, the reality is that Māori were treated shabbily in some respects after the treaty was signed, and I give instances of that. But by the same token, my biggest point in the book is that the idea of New Zealand being governed by a treaty partnership is a lie. It's a modern myth. It's not true. It's being done for political reasons, and all it does is cement in power a Māori elite and a Pākehā elite who will govern over the rest of us and share the spoils. What we need for New Zealand moving forward is a constitution that gives us an absolute democracy, that gives the people of all colours and creeds and races and religions equal standing in the law, and says that the politicians are our servants, not our masters.
We also are going to give 3 of these books away, and with great pleasure, because I know it's going to be a wonderful read. What we need is a question.
All right, Gerard, well, here's a really easy question. If you want to go in the draw, what's the title of this book?
Wow, what a perfect question. Just put the title of the book, The Great Divide, in the subject line. Email Gerard@thebeatgoeson, and you could win one of these fabulous books. Ian Wishart, thank you once again for coming into The Beat Goes On and keeping us up to date with what's happening in this wonderful country of ours.